The candles guttered low in the drawing-room of Ashford Manor on the evening of March 15th, 1814, their feeble light casting long shadows across walls stripped bare of the paintings that once hung there, sold off one by one to creditors who came with increasing frequency to the door. Eleanor Ashford sat in the worn velvet chair by the dying fire, her black mourning dress absorbing what little warmth remained in the room, her fingers wrapped around the simple gold locket at her throat that had belonged to her mother just 3 weeks before. The cold rain beat against the windows with a relentless rhythm that matched the hollow ache in her chest, and she suppressed another cough that had plagued her since the exhausting weeks of nursing her mother through her final illness, nights without sleep blurring into days of desperate hope that had ultimately proved futile. She was 24 years old, and utterly alone now, the youngest daughter whom society deemed too plain and far too bookish, the one her father had never troubled to hide his disappointment in producing. The sound of boots in the hallway announced Sir Thomas Ashford before he appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with drink, his cravat askew, and something triumphant glittering in his bloodshot eyes that made Eleanor's stomach clench with familiar dread. He swayed slightly as he crossed the threshold, a folded letter clutched in his hand like a trophy, and when he smiled at her, it was the smile of a man who had finally found a use for something he had long considered worthless. "Your mother is barely cold in her grave, and already she proves useful to me at last," he announced, his words slurring at the edges, "for without her bleeding me dry with physician bills I have been able to settle certain pressing matters." Eleanor remained still, years of practice having taught her that silence was the safest response to her father in his cups, though her heart began to pound beneath the weight of the locket. "I have sold you," he continued with grotesque satisfaction, "sold you to the Duke of Ravenswood for £500, and you should be grateful that anyone would pay so much for such a plain and difficult creature as yourself." The words struck her like physical blows, and yet she did not flinch, only felt something in ses mains grow very cold and very quiet, as the last ember of hope she had not known she still carried finally turned to ash. She thought of her mother who had taught her to read Latin and Greek, who had filled her mind with poetry and philosophy, who had loved her with a fierce, protective tenderness that had been the only warmth in this cold house, and she understood now that whatever protection that love had offered was gone forever. "You leave in 3 days," her father said, already turning away as though the matter required no further discussion, and Eleanor sat motionless in her chair as the fire died completely and the darkness gathered around her like a shroud, the rain continuing its endless assault against the windows of the only home she had ever known. The dawn of March 18th, 1814, broke grey and cold over Ashford Manor as Eleanor descended the stairs at 5 in the morning with her small trunk clutched in hands that trembled not from fear but from the bone-deep chill that had settled into her chest, her cough worse now from the cold air that crept through every crack in the neglected house. She had packed carefully in the dark hours before sunrise, folding her 2 remaining dresses around the 4 books she refused to leave behind, volumes her mother had given her over the years, with inscriptions on the fly-leaves that she traced with her fingertips when the grief threatened to drown her, and she wore the gold locket against her skin, where it lay cold as a secret over her heart. Her father waited in the front hall with the impatience of a man eager to complete a distasteful transaction, his eyes moving past her to the carriage that stood waiting in the drive, and when she paused at the bottom of the stairs, he made a sound of irritation that cut through the morning stillness. "Do not dawdle," he said without looking at her. "The Duke's man has been waiting, and I have matters to attend to." And Eleanor understood that she was already forgotten, that the £500 had been counted, and her existence had served its only purpose in his eyes. She walked past him toward the door, and he did not move to embrace her or offer any word of farewell until she had nearly crossed the threshold, and then his voice followed her into the grey morning with words that would echo in her mind for weeks to come. "Try not to disappoint him too quickly," he said with a cruel smile she could hear without turning to see. though I cannot imagine he expects much from such plain and difficult goods, and Eleanor felt something small and fierce kindle in her chest, a spark of defiance that surprised her with its heat. She did not turn back, did not grant him the satisfaction of seeing how his words landed, and instead stepped out into the threatening rain and found herself facing a carriage far finer than any her father had ever owned, its lacquered sides gleaming even in the dull light, its horses sleek and well-fed in a way that spoke of wealth beyond anything she had known. The driver was a kind-faced older man who introduced himself as Peters and helped her into the carriage with a gentleness that brought unexpected tears to her eyes, and as she settled onto velvet cushions softer than her own bed, she wondered what manner of man would send such a fine carriage for a woman he had purchased like livestock. The carriage rolled forward, and Eleanor did not look back at the house where she had been born, where her mother had died, where her father had sold her without a moment of hesitation, and as the wheels carried her north toward an unknown fate, she found that beneath the terror and the numbness there flickered something she had not expected to feel, something that might have been relief at finally leaving the prison she had called home. The carriage rounded a bend in the road at 4 in the afternoon on March 20th, 1814, and Eleanor Ashford caught her first glimpse of Pembroke Estate through windows misted with the condensation of 2 days of travel, her breath catching in her throat at the sight of grey stone walls rising against the fading winter light, like something from the novels her mother had read to her as a child. The estate sprawled across the landscape with a grandeur that made Ashford Manor seem like a gardener's cottage, its vast gardens dormant but clearly tended even in the grip of late winter, its windows glowing with warm light that promised fires burning in every hearth and none of the desperate cold she had grown accustomed to in her father's neglected house. She clutched her mother's locket so tightly that the gold edge pressed painfully into her palm, and she forced herself to breathe slowly as the carriage rolled up the long drive lined with bare trees that would surely be magnificent in summer, but now stood like silent witnesses to her arrival, their branches reaching toward the grey sky like supplicating arms. Peters brought the carriage to a gentle stop before the main entrance, and before Eleanor could steel herself for whatever awaited her inside, the great doors opened and a woman emerged wearing the neat, dark dress of a senior servant, her grey-streaked hair pinned beneath a white cap and her face bearing an expression of keen curiosity that softened into something like concern as she took in Eleanor's travel-worn morning dress and the shadows beneath her eyes. "I am Mrs. Fleming, the housekeeper," the woman said in a voice warm as the light spilling from the doorway behind her. "And you must be Miss Ashford. Poor dear, you look absolutely exhausted from your journey," and she was helping Eleanor down from the carriage and shepherding her inside before Eleanor could formulate a single word of response. The warmth of the house enveloped her like an embrace, fires crackling in rooms she glimpsed as Mrs. Fleming guided her through the entrance hall with its soaring ceiling and gleaming marble floors, and Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes because she could not remember the last time anyone had touched her with such careful kindness or spoken to her with such genuine warmth. High above in a window overlooking the drive, Alexander Pembroke stood in the shadows of his study, watching the small figure in black being ushered inside, noting how she had clutched the locket at her throat, how thin she looked, how her shoulders had been braced as though expecting a blow, and he felt something twist in his chest that might have been anger at the man who had reduced her to such a state, or might have been something far more dangerous to his carefully guarded heart. Mrs. Fleming led Eleanor up a grand staircase and down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, stopping at last, before a door that opened onto a room so beautiful Eleanor forgot for a moment to be afraid, with soft blue walls and a fire already burning, and a bed draped in white linens that looked softer than clouds. "This is your room," Mrs. Fleming said with quiet emphasis on the word your, "in the family wing where His Grace thought you would be most comfortable, and you need not worry about meeting him until tomorrow morning when you have had proper rest and a good meal." Eleanor stood in the center of the room that was somehow hers, confusion warring with exhaustion on her face, because nothing about this cold arrangement was unfolding as she had expected, and as the last rays of sunset broke through the clouds to cast golden light across the floor, she wondered what manner of man gave a purchased woman a room fit for a duchess. Eleanor descended the stairs on the morning of March 21st, 1814, at precisely 10 in the morning, with her armor firmly in place. Her better morning dress brushed clean of travel dust, and her hair arranged as neatly as she could manage without a lady's maid, and she had spent the hours since dawn preparing herself for whatever cruelty or lechery awaited her in the breakfast room where Mrs. Fleming had informed her the Duke would receive her. She paused outside the door to steady her breathing and pressed her fingers briefly against the locket hidden beneath her bodice, drawing strength from its familiar weight. And then she lifted her chin and stepped into the room, prepared to face a monster, only to find instead a man standing by the window, with morning sunlight falling across features that were stern but not unkind. Dark hair touched with early threads of grey at the temples, and eyes the colour of winter storms that turned to meet hers with an expression she could not read. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and dressed impeccably in dark blue that spoke of wealth worn casually, and he did not move toward her, or make any gesture that might be construed as threatening, merely inclined his head in greeting, and said in a voice deeper than she had expected, "Miss Ashford, I trust you slept well. Please sit and have something to eat. You must be famished after your journey." Eleanor found herself seated at a table set with more food than she had seen in months. Fresh bread and butter and eggs and ham and hothouse flowers in a crystal vase that caught the light and scattered tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth. And she could not reconcile this gracious breakfast room with the cold transaction that had brought her here. The Duke seated himself across from her at a respectful distance and poured tea with his own hands rather than summoning a servant, and when she coughed slightly, he frowned and said he would have the physician called if she wished, an offer so unexpected that she could only stare at him in confusion. "I imagine you have questions," he said quietly, watching her with those grey eyes that seemed to see far more than she wished to reveal, "and I will answer what I can, though I must ask for your patience, as some explanations require time." And Eleanor heard herself asking in a voice steadier than she felt what exactly he expected of her in this arrangement. He set down his teacup with careful precision, and met her gaze directly and said, "I expect nothing of you, Miss Ashford, except that you allow yourself to rest and recover from what I suspect has been an exhausting ordeal. This house is open to you, the library and gardens and any room you wish to explore, and you are a guest here, not a prisoner, not a servant, not anything you might be fearing." She searched his face for the lie, for the cruelty hiding beneath the courtesy, and found only a guarded sincerity that confused her more than any threat could have done. And when she left the breakfast room an hour later, she realized with something like wonder that she was not afraid of him at all, only deeply and thoroughly bewildered by a man who seemed determined to defy every dark expectation she had carried with her into his home. The library found Eleanor on the afternoon of March 23rd, 1814, or perhaps she found it, drawn by some instinct that recognized sanctuary in the smell of paper and leather and dust that drifted through the door, left slightly ajar, as though in invitation, and when she pushed it open and stepped inside, she forgot for a moment to breathe at all. The room rose 2 stories high around her like a cathedral built for the worship of words, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books in every size and color, their spines gleaming gold and red and deep brown in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through tall windows and fell in bright rectangles across the worn carpet, and a spiral staircase of wrought iron twisted upward to a gallery that circled the upper level where even more volumes waited in patient rows. Eleanor pressed her hand against her chest where her heart had begun to beat with something that felt almost like joy, a sensation so unfamiliar after weeks of grief and fear that she barely recognized it, and she moved deeper into the room as though walking through a dream from which she feared to wake. Mrs. Fleming had tied a ribbon of pale grey into her hair that morning, declaring that Miss Ashford needed a bit of brightening even in mourning, and Eleanor had not possessed the will to refuse the small kindness, though now she was glad of it as she felt herself becoming somehow more herself with each step she took among these shelves. Her cough had nearly vanished under Mrs. Fleming's careful ministrations of honey and tea and warm fires, and she drew a deep breath of book-scented air without the painful catch that had plagued her lungs since her mother's death. She ran her fingers along the spines as she walked, reading titles that made her pulse quicken with recognition and longing, volumes of philosophy and natural history and poetry that she had only ever read about in the modest collection her mother had assembled, and when she climbed the spiral staircase to the gallery above, she found tucked in a corner a copy of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman that made her reach for it with trembling fingers. She opened it expecting the clean pages of an unread book, and found instead margins filled with handwriting she did not recognize, small, neat annotations that argued with the text and agreed with it, and asked questions of it as though the reader had been engaged in passionate conversation with the author herself. And when she read a note beside a passage about female education that said simply, "She is right, and we are fools to deny it," Eleanor felt something shift in her understanding of the man who had brought her here. She sank into a chair by the window and read for hours, following the trail of his thoughts through the margins, and when Mrs. Fleming appeared at 6 to announce that dinner would be served, and mentioned quietly that His Grace had asked the cook to prepare roast chicken, because he had learned it was Miss Ashford's favourite, Eleanor looked up from the book with the first genuinely warm thought she had permitted herself to feel toward Alexander Pembroke, blooming unexpected and fragile in her chest. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The dining room on the evening of March 25th, 1814, had been transformed from the grand formal space Eleanor had glimpsed on her first day into something altogether more intimate, with only 2 places set at one end of the long mahogany table and candelabras casting warm pools of golden light that pushed the shadows back to the far corners where they could not intrude upon the small circle of warmth created for just the 2 of them. And Eleanor found herself seated across from Alexander Pembroke, with a meal spread before her that she recognized with a sharp pang of emotion as all her favorites, the roast chicken and early spring vegetables, and fresh bread still warm from the oven, and a wine the color of garnets glowing in crystal glasses. Rain had returned to tap against the tall windows like a visitor seeking entry, and the sound created a cocoon around them that made the rest of the world seem very far away indeed. And Eleanor found that for the first time since arriving, she did not feel the need to keep her armor quite so firmly in place. She wore her mother's locket openly tonight, resting against the black silk of her morning dress, where the candlelight caught its simple gold surface, and she noticed Alexander's grey eyes flicker to it more than once, though he said nothing, merely filed the observation away behind that thoughtful gaze that she was beginning to understand saw far more than most. The conversation began with pleasantries about the meal and the weather, but somewhere between the first course and the second, it shifted into something more substantial when Eleanor mentioned a passage from the book she had been reading in the library, and Alexander's response revealed not only that he had read the same volume, but that he held opinions about it that were both unexpected and intriguing enough to draw her into genuine debate. She found herself leaning forward as she argued her point, forgetting to be cautious, forgetting that she was supposed to be guarded against this man who had purchased her from her father. And when he countered her argument with a reference to another text she had loved, she felt something spark between them that had nothing to do with the candlelight and everything to do with the recognition of a kindred mind. He mentioned almost casually that he had met her mother once, years ago, at a literary salon, and that Mrs. Ashford had impressed him with her intelligence and grace, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten at this unexpected gift of her mother seen through a stranger's admiring eyes. She told him then about her mother's love of books, how she had taught Eleanor to read before she could properly walk, how the small library at Ashford Manor had been her mother's sanctuary and her own, and Alexander listened with an attention that made her feel as though her words mattered, as though she herself mattered, a sensation so foreign after years of her father's dismissal that she hardly knew what to do with it. And then he said something wry about the absurdity of society matrons who judged books by their bindings rather than their contents. And Eleanor laughed, a real laugh that escaped before she could catch it, and the sound surprised her so much that she pressed her fingers to her lips as though she could push it back inside. And when she looked up, she found Alexander watching her with an expression so unguarded, so warmly pleased, that she felt heat rise to her cheeks, and something that might have been the first tentative stirring of hope unfurl in her chest, and she realized with wonder that she was smiling, truly smiling, for the first time since she had held her mother's hand and felt it go still. Lord Frederick Greville arrived at Pembroke Estate on the midday of March 28, 1814, precisely 1 week since Eleanor had first stepped through those grand doors, uncertain whether she was entering a prison or something else entirely, and his arrival shattered the quiet rhythm she had begun to establish, with an energy that swept through the halls like a warm wind carrying the scent of the outside world she had nearly forgotten existed beyond these walls and gardens, and the library that had become her sanctuary. Eleanor heard his voice before she saw him, a rich, jovial tone that echoed up the staircase where she stood frozen with a book pressed against her chest, and she found herself retreating to the library not out of fear, but out of something she did not immediately recognize, as possessiveness, a reluctance to share this space and this strange, fragile peace she had cultivated with a stranger who might disrupt the delicate understanding growing between herself and the Duke. She had dressed that morning in a day dress of soft dove grey that Mrs. Fleming had procured from somewhere, insisting that Miss Ashford had mourned quite properly and that her dear mother would not wish her to fade away into black forever. And though Eleanor had protested, she had secretly been grateful to feel something other than grief wrapped around her body like a shroud. From her position in the gallery of the library, she could hear voices drifting up from the study below, and though she told herself firmly that eavesdropping was beneath her dignity, her feet carried her closer to the door left slightly ajar until she could distinguish words between the two men whose friendship she had not known existed until this moment. Lord Greville's voice was teasing but warm as he said something about Alexander finally emerging from his hermitage, and Alexander's response was low and almost defensive, in a way Eleanor had never heard from him, and then Greville laughed and said he had to meet this mysterious creature who had accomplished what no one else had managed in 3 years of trying. Eleanor's cheeks flushed at being called a creature, but her embarrassment transformed into something else entirely, when Greville's voice dropped lower, and she heard him say with sudden seriousness that he hoped Alexander knew what he was doing, that the amount had been considerable, and Alexander's reply came sharp and swift that she was worth far more than her father knew or would ever understand. Eleanor pressed her hand against the bookshelf to steady herself as the words echoed through her mind. Amount and worth and father, puzzle pieces that refused to form a coherent picture, and when she was summoned to tea an hour later, she found herself seated across from a red-haired man with laughing eyes and the sharp assessing gaze of a lawyer beneath his jovial manner, and she watched him watch her as though measuring something invisible. And when he smiled at her with genuine warmth and told Alexander that he understood now, he truly understood, Eleanor felt the frost on the windows behind her, and wondered what exactly Lord Frederick Greville had seen in her that she herself had never been able to find. The morning of April 2nd and 1814 dawned with a warmth that Eleanor had not felt since leaving Ashford Manor. A gentle, insistent heat that crept through her window and stirred something restless in her chest that she could not name but could not ignore, and by 11 o'clock she found herself standing in the doorway of the breakfast-room where Alexander sat reading correspondence with that thoughtful furrow between his brows that she had begun to recognize as concentration rather than displeasure, and before she could think better of it, she heard her own voice asking if he might show her the gardens since the weather had finally turned, and she had been inside for 2 weeks, and surely fresh air could not be forbidden even to women of uncertain status, and the words came out bolder than she intended, with an edge that surprised them both. Alexander looked up from his letters, and something flickered across his stern features that might have been amusement or might have been pleasure, and he set aside his papers and rose, and said simply that he would be honored to accompany her if she would permit him, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the formality that somehow felt less like distance now and more like care. They walked out through the glass doors of the morning room into gardens that were shaking off winter like a creature emerging from long sleep, with crocuses pushing purple and gold through dark earth, and early daffodils nodding their yellow heads in the slight breeze that carried the scent of soil, warming in sunshine, and growing things reaching toward light. Eleanor wore the grey dress with lavender ribbons that Mrs. Fleming had insisted upon. Half mourning now, the housekeeper had declared, and Eleanor had not argued, because the colour felt like permission to feel something other than grief. And her mother's locket caught the sunlight as they walked, and she saw Alexander S. eyes drawn to it more than once. He told her as they passed a rose arbour still bare and waiting for spring that his mother had designed these gardens when she was a young bride, that she had spent 30 years coaxing beauty from this northern soil, and his voice softened in a way Eleanor had never heard as he spoke of a woman 10 years gone who had loved flowers and books, and her difficult, serious son who never quite fit the mould society expected. Eleanor found herself telling him about her own motherless roses at Ashford Manor, the small garden that had been her sanctuary, now surely overgrown and neglected with no one left to tend it, and her voice caught on the words, and she had to look away toward a patch of crocuses to compose herself. They came to a place where the path turned muddy from melting frost, and Alexander stopped and extended his hand without speaking, and Eleanor looked at that hand for a long moment before she placed her own within it, and felt warmth and strength and a careful gentleness as he guided her over the treacherous ground, and when she was safely across, neither of them immediately let go. He asked then about her locket, his voice quiet, and Eleanor pressed her free hand against the gold at her throat and told him it was her mother's, the only thing of value her father had not sold, and Alexander nodded as though this confirmed something he had already known, and said only that her mother must have been remarkable to raise such a daughter, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes and hope flutter terrifying and wonderful in her chest. The evening of April 5th, 1814, settled over Pembroke Estate with a heaviness that matched the turmoil in Eleanor's chest, and by 9:00 she found herself sitting at the small writing desk in her bedroom, unable to concentrate on the book she had brought from the library, her thoughts circling endlessly around the memory of Alexander's hand holding hers in the garden, and the words Lord Greville had spoken about worth and amounts and things her father did not know. And when a soft knock came at her door, she was almost relieved to see Mrs. Fleming entering with the nightly chamomile tea that had become their quiet ritual, the older woman's kind face illuminated by the candle she carried against the growing darkness. The storm that had threatened all day was finally arriving, wind rattling the windows in their frames, and the first drops of rain beginning to tap against the glass, like fingers seeking entry, and Eleanor accepted the warm cup, with hands that trembled slightly as she asked the question that had been burning in her throat for days, asking Mrs. Fleming directly why the Duke had chosen her specifically when surely there were other women with fathers willing to sell them for gambling debts, women prettier and younger and less plain and bookish than Eleanor Ashford, who had never been chosen for anything in her entire life. Mrs. Fleming set down the teapot and settled into the chair across from Eleanor with the careful movements of someone preparing to share something significant. And she told Eleanor that His Grace had not simply responded to an offer from Sir Thomas, but had sought out that particular arrangement after years of quiet inquiry, that he had heard Eleanor's name spoken in connection with an act of kindness she had likely forgotten entirely, a small moment of compassion shown to his elderly Aunt Beatrice at a garden party some 4 years past, when Eleanor had noticed the old woman struggling alone and had spent an hour keeping her company while everyone else ignored her existence. Eleanor pressed her hand against her mother's locket as the memory surfaced hazily, an afternoon she barely recalled. An old woman in lavender who had smiled with such gratitude at simple conversation, and Mrs. Fleming continued softly that His Grace's aunt had spoken of the young Miss Ashford often before her death last year, had called her the only genuine soul in a room full of pretenders, and that Alexander had never forgotten that description, even as he searched for the woman who matched it. The candle on Eleanor's dressing table guttered in a draught as the storm intensified outside, casting dancing shadows across the walls of this room that had somehow become more home than Ashford Manor ever was, and Eleanor found herself unable to speak as Mrs. Fleming added quietly that the amount His Grace had paid was not what her father had claimed, though she would not say more than that, only that Eleanor should understand she had never been worthless, even when she believed it most deeply. Long after Mrs. Fleming had gone, and the tea had grown cold, and the storm had wrapped the estate in howling wind and driving rain, Eleanor sat motionless at her desk with her mother's locket clutched in her fist, reconsidering everything she had believed about her value and her place in the world, unable to sleep, as the realization settled into her bones that somewhere in her forgotten past she had mattered to someone without even knowing it. The morning of April 8th, 1814, broke through the fog that had wrapped Pembroke Estate for 3 days, and Eleanor came down to breakfast at 9:05 to find Alexander already seated with a silver tray before him, bearing not his usual correspondence, but a single letter on cream stationery that he held out to her without speaking, his grey eyes watching her face with an intensity that made her pause in the doorway before she crossed to take it from his hand, and she saw immediately that the handwriting was not her father. Cramped, impatient script, but something feminine and elegant and somehow familiar in a way that made her heart clench before she even broke the seal. The letter was from Lady Harriet Sinclair of Wiltshire, and Eleanor read those words 3 times before they made sense, because she had believed her mother's sister dead these 15 years, had been told by her father when she was 9 that Aunt Harriet had perished in a fever, and that Eleanor must never speak of her again. And yet here were pages covered in desperate, loving words, asking if Eleanor was safe and well, and explaining that Harriet had written dozens of letters over the years that were never answered, had tried to visit only to be turned away, had mourned her sister's recent death from a distance because Thomas Ashford had forbidden all contact and threatened legal action if she persisted. Eleanor's hands began to shake so violently that the cream pages rattled, and she had to sit down hard in the nearest chair, her tea growing cold and her breakfast untouched as she read about an aunt who had loved her mother fiercely and who had desperately wanted to know her only niece, who had kept every scrap of information about Eleanor that filtered through society gossip, who had wept when she learned Eleanor had been sent to Pembroke, and who begged Alexander in a separate note that he had clearly already read to tell her that her niece was being treated kindly. Alexander's voice came quiet and careful through the roaring in Eleanor's ears as he explained that he had written to Lady Harriet himself after discovering the connection, that he had suspected Thomas Ashford had isolated Eleanor deliberately, and had wanted her to know she was not as alone in the world as her father had made her believe. And Eleanor looked up at this man who had paid money she did not understand for her freedom, and who was now giving her family. She thought she had lost, and something cracked open in her chest that she had kept sealed since her mother's final breath. The tears came then, for the first time since that terrible night in her father's study, great heaving sobs that she could not control and did not try to hide, and Alexander moved from his chair and came to stand beside her, but did not touch her, simply remained close enough that she could feel his warmth and his steady presence as she wept for her mother and her stolen aunt, and the lonely girl who had believed herself unloved. And when she finally looked up with tears still streaming down her cheeks, the fog outside had cleared entirely, and sunlight was pouring golden through the windows like a promise she was only beginning to understand. The evening of April the 10th, 1814, found Eleanor standing before the library doors at 8:00, with her heart pounding so fiercely she could feel it in her throat. And when she pushed through into the fire-lit space, she saw Alexander already there, as if he had been waiting for her, standing near the spiral staircase with shadows playing across his face and his grey eyes reflecting the flames that burned low in the grate. And she did not allow herself to hesitate or soften her resolve as she crossed the Persian carpet and stopped 3 feet from him and demanded in a voice that shook only slightly that he tell her the truth about why he had paid her father for her, why he had sought her specifically. Why any of this had happened at all, because she could no longer bear the not knowing that had kept her awake for 2 nights straight, turning questions over in her mind like stones in a river. Alexander's face shifted through something that looked like relief and fear combined, as he gestured toward the chairs by the fire. But Eleanor shook her head and remained standing with her back toward the spiral staircase, and her hands clasped together to keep them from trembling. And after a long moment he nodded, and began to speak in a voice rougher than she had ever heard from him, telling her about a funeral he had attended 5 years ago in the autumn of 1809, when his father had died, and he had been so consumed by grief that he could barely speak to the endless parade of mourners who came to offer hollow condolences. He told her that he had escaped to the garden of the church to breathe and to be alone with his pain, and that a young woman in a blue dress had found him there and had not offered platitudes or empty sympathy, but had simply sat beside him on the cold stone bench and said that grief was not something to be conquered, but something to be carried, and that carrying it did not make him weak, but simply made him human. Eleanor felt something stir in the depths of her memory as he spoke. A grey autumn day, and her mother's hand on her arm, and a man whose face she could not see clearly because he had turned away to hide his tears. And Alexander continued that he had asked her name, and she had told him, and then her mother had called her away, and he had watched her go, and had spent the next 5 years trying to find her again, only to discover she had been hidden away by a father who kept her isolated from the world. His voice cracked when he told her that when he finally learned of Thomas Ashford's debts and his willingness to sell his daughter to settle them, he had seen it not as an opportunity to purchase a woman, but as the only chance he might ever have to bring her somewhere safe and discover if the kindness he remembered was real or merely a grieving man's desperate fantasy. Eleanor stood frozen as the rain began again outside the tall windows, and the fire crackled and popped in the silence that followed his confession, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of herself as worthless and unwanted with this revelation that someone had searched for her across years and miles. And when he took a single step toward her, she turned and fled up the spiral staircase to her room. The morning of April 11th, 1814, found Eleanor still in her room at Pembroke Estate, as the rain that had begun during Alexander's confession continued to fall in sheets against her window, and she lay curled in the center of her bed, with her mother's gold locket clutched so tightly in her palm that the delicate filigree left imprints on her skin, her mind circling back again and again to the words he had spoken in the fire-lit library the night before, as she tried to reconcile the image of herself that her father had carved into her soul with this impossible new truth that someone had searched for her across years and miles because of a single act of kindness she could barely remember. The memory came back to her in fragments throughout the long grey hours as Mrs. Fleming knocked softly and left trays of food outside her door without demanding entry. First the smell of autumn leaves and cold stone, then the sound of distant hymns, weeping, then gradually the shape of a church garden in late October of 1809, when she had been 19 and attending a funeral with her mother for some distant connection of her father's that he himself had not bothered to attend. And she remembered now how she had slipped away from the crowd of black-clad mourners because their hollow condolences had felt suffocating, and how she had found a man sitting alone on a stone bench with his shoulders shaking and his face turned away, and how something in his solitary grief had reminded her so powerfully of her own loneliness that she had simply sat down beside him without speaking. She had not offered prayers or platitudes, because even at 19 she had known how empty such words could feel, and instead she had said only that grief was not a weakness to be conquered, but a weight to be carried, and that carrying it did not diminish him, but simply proved he had loved someone worth mourning, and he had turned to look at her with grey eyes red-rimmed from weeping, and had asked her name, and she had told him Eleanor Ashford, before her mother called her away, and she had returned to her invisible life and forgotten the encounter entirely within a fortnight. But he had not forgotten her, and as Eleanor pressed the locket to her lips and tasted the salt of her own tears, she understood for the first time that the small kindnesses she offered to the world, without expectation of return, had not disappeared into the void, as she had always believed, but had instead taken root in someone's heart and grown into something she could not yet name, but could feel trembling at the edges of her consciousness like spring pressing against the frozen ground. She rose from her bed as the afternoon light began to fail and crossed to the small writing desk by the window, where she opened her journal for the first time since arriving at Pembroke, and wrote in a shaking hand that tomorrow she would go to him and speak the words she was only now beginning to find. The morning of April 12th, 1814, arrived with pale golden sunlight breaking through the clouds for the first time in 3 days, and Eleanor rose from her bed at Pembroke Estate, with a strange calm settling over her heart as she washed her face and dressed in the soft grey gown with lavender trim that Mrs. Fleming had laid out, and fastened her mother's locket around her throat with fingers that trembled only slightly. And when she descended the main staircase at 9:30, she found Alexander waiting in the entrance hall as if he had been standing there for hours, not knowing whether she would come down at all, his dark hair slightly dishevelled and shadows beneath his grey eyes suggesting he had slept as poorly as she had. And for a long moment they simply looked at each other across the black and white marble floor, while dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through the tall windows, and neither seemed to know how to begin this conversation that would either build a bridge between them or burn whatever fragile connection had formed over the past 3 weeks. Eleanor was the one who finally spoke, her voice steadier than she had expected, as she told him that she remembered now, remembered the stone bench and the autumn leaves and the way he had turned to look at her with grief written across every line of his face, and she remembered too that she had not offered him comfort because she thought it would matter, but simply because she could not bear to see another person suffering alone the way she herself had always suffered. And Alexander's expression shifted into something raw and unguarded as he took a single step toward her and said, that was precisely why her words had stayed with him through every empty year that followed, because she had expected nothing in return, and that had made her kindness the only real thing he had encountered in a world full of people who wanted something from him. She moved closer without quite deciding to, drawn by the honesty in his voice and the way his hands hung at his sides as if he was forcing himself not to reach for her, and she told him that she had spent her entire life believing she was invisible and worthless because that was what her father had taught her to believe, and she did not know how to reconcile that with the knowledge that someone had searched for her across 5 years and finally found her and brought her to this beautiful place, not to use her, but simply because he remembered her voice on an autumn afternoon when she was 19 and did not yet know that small kindnesses could echo across time. Alexander closed the remaining distance between them until only 2 feet separated them, and said her name, just Eleanor, without the formal Miss Ashford he had used since her arrival, and the sound of it in his deep voice made something unlock in her chest that she had kept bolted shut for as long as she could remember. The days that followed April 12th, 1814, unfolded at Pembroke Estate with a tender fragility that Eleanor had never before experienced, as she and Alexander began to navigate the strange new territory between strangers and something more, taking their meals together now, with conversation flowing more easily, and walking in the gardens each afternoon as the spring flowers continued to emerge from the warming earth, and she found herself watching for the small signs of his true nature that she had been too guarded to notice before, the way he remembered every book she mentioned wanting to read, and had it waiting on the library table the next morning, the way he spoke to the servants with genuine courtesy rather than cold command, the way his grey eyes softened when he thought she was not looking, and hardened again when he caught himself, as if he was afraid of wanting too much from this arrangement that had begun in such mercenary circumstances. On April 15th, 1814, they sat together in the library after dinner, while rain drummed against the windows, and Eleanor found the courage to ask him about the years between that autumn funeral and the day her father had drunkenly announced her sale, and Alexander's voice grew rough as he described how he had tried to find her, how he had remembered only her first name, and the connection to his father's distant cousin, whose funeral it had been. How he had searched through guest lists and made inquiries through society connections, and finally traced her to Ashford Manor, only to discover that her father was drowning in gambling debts, and that Eleanor herself was spoken of as unmarriageable and invisible, and destined to become a burden on whatever relative would take her when Sir Thomas finally drank himself into the grave. He told her that he had written to her father under the pretence of business, and had received in return a letter so callous in its assessment of Eleanor's lack of value that Alexander had known immediately he could not leave her in that man's keeping, and when the opportunity arose to offer payment in exchange for her removal to Pembroke Estate, he had taken it without hesitation, though he had always intended to give her the choice to leave once she understood the situation, a choice he was offering her now with visible pain in his expression as he said the words. Eleanor felt her heart constrict as she looked at this man who had searched for her across 5 years because of a few kind words spoken in a garden, this man who had paid an unknown sum to rescue her from her father's cruelty and then had given her space and books and kindness without ever demanding anything in return. And she understood suddenly that the question was not whether she could trust him, but whether she could trust herself to accept that she deserved to be wanted. And she reached across the space between their chairs and laid her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his seat, and said simply that she was not going anywhere. The morning of April 16, 1814, brought with it a shift in the very atmosphere of Pembroke Estate that even the servants remarked upon in hushed tones as they went about their duties, for the Duke, who had been known throughout the county as cold and unreachable, now smiled when he thought no one was watching, and lingered at breakfast long past his usual hour. And Eleanor, who had arrived a month ago as a pale ghost in mourning, black now laughed aloud in the library, and walked the gardens with colour rising in her cheeks, and her mother's locket catching the spring sunlight, as if it too had awakened from a long winter sleep. Mrs. Fleming observed these changes with quiet satisfaction, as she directed the household staff, and ensured that fresh flowers appeared in Eleanor's room each morning, and that the cook prepared the dishes Miss Ashford favoured. And when Lord Greville arrived unexpectedly on April 18th, for what he claimed was urgent legal business, the housekeeper noticed how his sharp eyes moved between Alexander and Eleanor at dinner, and how his jovial expression softened into something like relief when he saw the way they leaned toward each other across the candle-lit table as they debated the merits of various poets with the easy intimacy of old friends rather than the awkward formality of strangers bound by a financial transaction. Eleanor found herself telling Lord Greville about her mother's love of literature and how she had taught Eleanor to read Latin and Greek, despite her father's objections that such education was wasted on a plain girl who would never marry well, and she watched Alexander's jaw tighten at this casual reference to her father's cruelty, even as his grey eyes remained gentle when they met hers, and something warm and fragile expanded in her chest at the evidence that her pain mattered to him, that he felt anger on her behalf when she had spent so many years believing her suffering was invisible to everyone but herself. After dinner, Lord Greville drew Alexander aside for a private conversation in the study, while Eleanor retired to the library with a book she could not concentrate on because her thoughts kept returning to the way Alexander had said her name that morning. Just Eleanor, as if it were something precious. And when he rejoined her an hour later with papers in his hand and a strange, nervous energy in his movements, she set aside her unread book and waited for him to speak. He told her that there were things she deserved to know about the arrangement her father had made, things he had withheld because he feared they would overwhelm her before she had time to feel safe. And Eleanor's heart began to pound as he sat beside her on the library settee, closer than he had ever sat before, and explained that her father had not sold her for £500, as he had drunkenly boasted, but had in fact demanded £5,000, and Alexander had paid it without hesitation, because no amount of money could equal the value of the woman who had shown kindness to a grieving stranger on the worst day of his life. The number struck Eleanor like a physical blow as she sat beside Alexander on the library settee on that evening of April 18, 1814, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what he had just revealed. For £5,000 was a fortune beyond anything she had imagined, a sum that could have purchased a modest estate or funded a comfortable life for decades, and her father had taken it and told her she was worth only 500, had looked her in the eyes with whiskey on his breath, and sneered that even that amount was generous for a plain, bookish spinster whom no man would ever want. She felt Alexander's hand turn beneath hers so that their fingers intertwined, warm and steady and real. And she heard him speaking in that low, rough voice that seemed to reach past all her defenses as he explained that the money meant nothing to him, but her safety meant everything, that he would have paid twice that amount, or 10 times if necessary, because he had spent 5 years haunted by the memory of soft brown eyes filled with genuine compassion and a gentle voice that had asked a grieving stranger if he needed someone to sit with him in his sorrow. Eleanor thought of her father counting coins in the shabby drawing-room while she packed her meagre belongings, thought of him telling her she should be grateful anyone would take her off his hands, thought of all the years she had believed herself worthless because the one person who should have valued her had instead calculated her price like livestock at market, and something cracked open inside her chest that was not grief, but rather the death of the lie she had carried for so long. She looked at Alexander's face in the candlelight, at the stern features that had frightened her when she first arrived, and now seemed only beautiful in their intensity, at the grey eyes that watched her with such careful hope, as if he feared she would flee again. And she understood that this man had seen her worth before she had learned to see it herself, had recognized something valuable in a moment of kindness that she had given freely, and then forgotten. And she felt tears sliding down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sensation of being truly known for the first time in her adult life. She whispered that she did not know how to be worth £5,000, did not know how to be the woman he had searched for across half a decade, and Alexander lifted his free hand to brush the tears from her cheek with infinite gentleness, as he told her she had always been worth immeasurably more than any sum, and that he only hoped she might someday allow him the privilege of spending his life proving it to her. The days that followed, April 18th, 1814, unfolded with a tender new rhythm at Pembroke Estate as Eleanor and Alexander navigated the delicate territory between confession and commitment, for though much had been revealed in the candlelit library, there remained a careful distance between them, as if both feared that moving too quickly might shatter the fragile understanding they had built, and Eleanor found herself watching him across the breakfast table each morning with new eyes that saw not the stern, cold Duke of Society's whispers, but the man who had remembered her voice for 5 years and paid a fortune to find her again, and now sat reading his correspondence with such studied casualness that she knew he was as aware of her gaze as she was of his presence. She spent the morning of April 20th composing a letter to Aunt Harriet with Alexander's blessing, her pen trembling slightly as she wrote words she had never dared speak aloud about her father's cruelty and her mother's death, and the strange, unexpected sanctuary she had found in the home of a man she was only beginning to understand. And when Alexander appeared in the doorway of the small sitting room, where she wrote and asked quietly if she needed anything, she felt her heart turn over in her chest at the careful hope in his grey eyes, and the way he held himself back, as if afraid of overwhelming her. That afternoon they walked together through the gardens where spring had arrived in earnest now, with tulips pushing through the dark earth and the fruit trees beginning to show the first pale promises of blossoms. And Eleanor told him about her mother's final weeks, and the books they had read together, and the way her father had forbidden the physician to return because the expense was not worth the investment in a dying woman who had already failed to produce a son. And Alexander's hand found hers, without either of them quite deciding to reach for the other, and remained there warm and steady as they walked in silence that felt more intimate than any words could have been. In the evening, Lord Greville departed after extracting a promise from Alexander that he would bring Eleanor to London for the season so that society might see the woman who had finally thawed the heart of the cold Duke of Ravenswood, and Eleanor felt a flutter of fear at the thought of facing the ton who had dismissed her as plain and unmarriageable, but Alexander squeezed her hand and told her she need never face anything alone again if she did not wish it, and she believed him with a certainty that still surprised her when she examined it in the quiet of her room. Later that night, she wrote in her journal by candlelight as the house settled into sleep around her, recording the way his voice softened when he spoke to her and the particular shade of grey his eyes became in firelight, and the extraordinary realization that she was no longer afraid of her future for the first time since her mother had drawn her final breath in that cold, shabby room at Ashford Manor. The morning of April 22nd, 1814, brought with it a letter that changed everything, arriving on the silver tray that Peters carried into the breakfast room, where Eleanor and Alexander sat in the companionable silence that had become their custom, and Eleanor recognized her father's careless scrawl on the outside of the folded paper before Alexander could intercept it, her hand reaching out with a steadiness she did not feel as she took the missive and broke the seal, while Alexander watched with barely concealed concern, darkening his grey eyes to the colour of winter storms. The words swam before her vision at first, her father's familiar contempt leaching through every hastily penned line as he informed her that he had lost the remaining funds at the gaming tables within a fortnight of her departure, and now found himself in need of additional support, suggesting with breathtaking audacity that she might persuade her duke to provide another sum in exchange for certain documents he possessed, letters her mother had written to Aunt Harriet that he had intercepted over the years, and which contained sentiments about Eleanor that might prove embarrassing if circulated among society. And Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she understood that her father was attempting to extort the man who had already paid a fortune to save her from precisely this kind of cruelty. She heard Alexander's voice as if from a great distance, asking what was wrong, and without speaking she handed him the letter and watched his expression transform from concern to cold fury as he read, his jaw tightening and his hands gripping the paper so hard that it crumpled at the edges. And when he looked up at her, his eyes held a dangerous glitter that she had never seen before as he told her quietly that her father would receive nothing more from him except perhaps a visit from Lord Greville explaining the legal consequences of attempted blackmail against a peer of the realm. Eleanor found herself laughing then, a strange broken sound that surprised them both, because she realized that her father's greed had finally overreached itself, and that the man sitting across from her was not merely wealthy and kind, but powerful enough to protect her in ways she had never dared imagine. And when Alexander rounded the table to kneel beside her chair and take her trembling hands in his own, she did not pull away, but instead leaned forward until her forehead rested against his shoulder and felt his arms come around her with exquisite care, as if she were something precious and fragile that he feared to damage. He murmured against her hair that she would never have to fear her father again, that he would ensure the letters were recovered, and that Sir Thomas Ashford understood the full weight of his displeasure, and Eleanor breathed in the scent of him and felt something settle into place in her chest that might have been peace or might have been the first stirrings of something far more terrifying and wonderful as she whispered her thanks against the fine wool of his coat and felt him press a kiss to the crown of her head, so gently she might have imagined it. The days following her father's attempted extortion passed in a blur of quiet consultations and whispered conferences as Lord Greville returned to Pembroke Estate on April the 24th, 1814, with documents requiring signatures and news requiring careful delivery, and Eleanor found herself included in these discussions in a way that would have been unthinkable mere weeks ago when she had arrived at this house expecting to be treated as property rather than as a person whose opinions mattered and whose future was her own to shape. She sat in the library beside Alexander as Greville explained that her father had been visited by representatives of the Duke and made to understand in terms that left no room for misinterpretation that any further attempts to contact Eleanor or to profit from her situation would result in the full exposure of his financial misdeeds to every creditor and social connection he possessed. And Eleanor felt a grim satisfaction settle in her chest at the thought of her father finally facing consequences for his cruelty, even as she mourned the relationship she had never truly had with the man who should have protected her. The recovered letters from her mother to Aunt Harriet arrived the following morning in a packet tied with faded ribbon, and Eleanor spent hours reading words her mother had written years ago, expressing love and hope and desperate worry for her youngest daughter trapped in a house with a man who saw her only as a burden and a disappointment. And she wept over passages that described her childhood self with such tenderness that she could almost feel her mother's hand smoothing her hair, as it had done so many times before illness stole her away. Alexander found her in the garden that afternoon, sitting on the bench beneath the apple tree with the letters spread across her lap and tears still drying on her cheeks. And without speaking, he sat beside her and waited until she was ready to share what she had learned, and when she finally told him that her mother had tried for years to arrange for Aunt Harriet to take her away from Ashford Manor, but her father had refused because he needed Eleanor to care for the household without wages, Alexander's expression hardened with a fury that she understood was not directed at her, but at the man who had stolen so many years of potential happiness from her life. She showed him the final letter dated just 3 months before, her mother's death, in which her mother had written that she prayed daily for Eleanor to find someone who would see her true worth and love her as she deserved to be loved. And Alexander's voice was rough when he told her that he intended to be that person if she would allow him the honor. And Eleanor felt her heart expand in her chest with an emotion she was finally brave enough to name, as she reached for his hand and held it tightly beneath the blossoming branches, while spring sunlight warmed them both. The afternoon of April the 26th, 1814, brought Aunt Harriet herself to Pembroke Estate, her carriage arriving in a flurry of spring rain and joyful tears as Eleanor rushed down the front steps to embrace the woman she had only known through letters until this moment, and the sensation of being held by someone who shared her mother's blood and her mother's fierce protective love overwhelmed Eleanor so completely that she wept against her aunt's traveling cloak, while Alexander watched from the doorway with an expression of quiet satisfaction that suggested he had arranged this reunion with the same careful attention he brought to everything concerning her happiness. Lady Harriet Sinclair proved to be everything her letters had promised and more. A woman of perhaps 50 years with silver threading through hair, the same chestnut shade as Eleanor's mother had worn, and eyes that crinkled with warmth as she cupped Eleanor's face in her hands and declared that she was the very image of her sister at this age and twice as lovely, despite what that wretched father of hers had undoubtedly told her all these years. The hours that followed passed in a blur of tea and conversation and shared memories of the mother Eleanor had lost, and she learned that Aunt Harriet had written dozens of letters over the years that her father had intercepted and destroyed, that she had tried twice to visit Ashford Manor and been turned away at the door with lies about illness and inconvenience, and that she had never stopped hoping to find her niece and bring her into the fold of family that had been denied to her for so long. Alexander excused himself to allow them privacy, but not before Aunt Harriet seized his hand and thanked him with tears in her eyes for restoring her sister's daughter to her. And Eleanor watched the flush that crept up his neck at the praise, and felt her heart clench with an emotion that grew stronger every day she spent in his presence. When evening fell and they gathered for dinner, Eleanor found herself seated between the two people who had come to matter most to her in all the world, and the conversation flowed easily between discussions of books and politics and memories of her mother's youth that Eleanor had never heard before, and she realized that she was building a family from the ashes of the one that had failed her so completely. Aunt Harriet stayed for 3 days, during which she and Eleanor walked the gardens and explored the library and talked until their voices grew hoarse, and before she departed, she drew Eleanor aside and told her quietly that she had never seen a man look at a woman the way the Duke looked at her, with such reverent attention and barely concealed longing that it made an old romantic's heart sing. And Eleanor felt the truth of those words settle into her bones, even as she protested that nothing had been declared between them. The carriage bearing her aunt away left Eleanor standing on the front steps with Alexander beside her, and when he asked quietly if she was happy, she turned to him with tears still drying on her cheeks and told him that she had not known it was possible to feel so full of hope after so many years of emptiness. The morning of April 28, 1814 dawned clear and golden over Pembroke Estate, as Eleanor stood before the mirror in her chamber and regarded herself with eyes that had learned to see differently over the past 6 weeks, noting not the plainness her father had always disparaged, but the intelligence in her gaze and the determined set of her chin and the way her mother's locket caught the light where it rested against the soft lavender of her morning dress. And she realized with a start that she looked like a woman who belonged in this beautiful house rather than an interloper waiting to be cast out. Alexander had requested her presence in the library at 10 o'clock, his note delivered by Mrs. Fleming with a knowing smile that suggested the housekeeper understood more about what was to transpire than Eleanor herself dared to hope. And as she descended the grand staircase with her heart beating a rhythm of anticipation against her ribs, she found herself thinking of that masked man at a funeral 5 years ago and marveling at the strange paths fate carved through human lives. The library doors stood open when she arrived, and Alexander waited within, standing before the tall windows where spring sunlight illuminated his features and softened the stern lines that society mistook for coldness. And when he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression held such unguarded hope that Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. He began without preamble, his voice steady, despite the tension visible in his shoulders, telling her that he had spent the weeks since her arrival attempting to earn her trust through patience and restraint, but that he could no longer pretend his feelings were anything other than what they had become. A profound attachment that had only deepened as he discovered the woman behind the brief kindness that had sustained him through his darkest hours of grief. Eleanor listened as he spoke of his loneliness before her arrival, of the way her presence had transformed the cold grandeur of Pembroke Estate into something approaching a home, of his certainty that she was the companion his heart had sought since that moment 5 years past, when a young woman with compassionate eyes had offered comfort to a stranger without expectation of reward. He told her that he had no wish to claim rights over her, that the circumstances of her arrival might suggest he possessed, that if she desired to leave, he would ensure she reached Aunt Harriet with every comfort and a settlement that would guarantee her independence forever, but that if she chose to stay, he would spend the remainder of his days endeavoring to be worthy of the gift of her regard. The silence that followed his declaration stretched between them like the held breath before a symphony's crescendo, and Eleanor found herself moving forward without conscious decision, crossing the sun-warmed carpet until she stood close enough to see the rapid pulse beating at his throat and the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. She told him that she had spent her life believing herself without value, that her father's cruelty had convinced her she deserved nothing more than the scraps of affection others deigned to offer, but that he had shown her through countless small kindnesses and patient attention that she was worthy of being sought and cherished and loved. The word yes fell from Eleanor's lips before she could question or doubt or retreat into the familiar safety of expecting nothing, and the sound of it seemed to transform the very air between them as Alexander's carefully maintained composure finally shattered, and he reached for her with hands that trembled against her cheeks as he cradled her face with such reverent tenderness that she felt tears spring unbidden to her eyes. He did not kiss her immediately, but instead stood holding her thus, his grey eyes searching hers as if memorizing every fleck of colour and every shadow of emotion that passed across her features. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with feeling as he told her that he had imagined this moment for 5 years, and that the reality of her acceptance exceeded every dream that had sustained him through his lonely nights. Eleanor found herself laughing through her tears at the absurdity of it all, that she who had been told she was worth nothing more than £500 to clear a gambling debt should be standing in this sun-drenched library, being looked upon as though she were the most precious treasure in all of England, and her laughter seemed to break something loose in Alexander as well, because he smiled then with an openness she had never witnessed from him before, the stern lines of his face transforming into something approaching boyish joy. When he finally lowered his lips to hers, the kiss was gentle at first, questioning and careful, as though she were something that might shatter at rough handling. but Eleanor found herself rising onto her toes and pressing closer with an urgency that surprised them both. And the kiss deepened into something that left her breathless and clinging to his lapels for support, while his arms wrapped around her waist and drew her firmly against the solid warmth of his chest. They stood thus for long moments as the spring sunlight painted golden patterns across the library carpet, and the dust motes danced in the air around them like tiny witnesses to this transformation of two lonely souls into something greater than either had been alone. And when they finally drew apart, Eleanor felt as though she had been remade entirely. The frightened girl who had arrived at Pembroke Estate 6 weeks ago, replaced by a woman who understood at last what it meant to be truly seen and valued. Alexander pressed his forehead to hers and confessed that he had not dared to hope she could return his feelings so soon, that he had prepared himself for months of patient courtship and the possibility that she might never see him as anything more than her rescuer. And Eleanor silenced him with another kiss that communicated more eloquently than words ever could. The depth of the connection that had grown between them through quiet dinners and garden walks and conversations in this very library, where they now stood wrapped in each other's arms. The future stretched before them like the gardens awakening beyond the windows, full of possibility and the promise of spring after a long and bitter winter. The news of the Duke of Ravenswood's engagement to the mysterious Miss Ashford spread through the county with the speed of wildfire carried on spring winds, and by the morning of April 29th, 1814, the drawing rooms of every respectable house within 30 miles buzzed with speculation about the plain young woman who had somehow captured one of England's most eligible and elusive bachelors. Eleanor learned of the gossip from Mrs. Fleming, who reported with barely concealed satisfaction that Lady Lydia Carstairs had sent her footman to inquire whether the rumours were true, and had received confirmation that set the social hierarchy of the region into delicious turmoil. And though Eleanor felt a flicker of anxiety at the thought of society's scrutiny, she found that Alexander's steady presence beside her at breakfast provided an anchor against the rising tide of public attention. He reached across the table to take her hand when he saw the worry shadow her features, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm as he assured her that she need not concern herself with the opinions of people who had never bothered to look beyond surfaces, that the same society matrons who would now clamour for her attention had walked past her at assemblies without a second glance when she was merely Sir Thomas Ashford's overlooked daughter. The bitterness in his voice when he spoke of how she had been treated surprised Eleanor, until she remembered that he too knew what it meant to be judged by reputation rather than character, to have the world see only the cold exterior that grief and loneliness had constructed as armour against further hurt. She lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to his knuckles, watching the way his grey eyes softened at the gesture, and she told him that she cared nothing for society's approval so long as she had his, that the whispers of 100 Lady Lydias could not diminish the joy she had found within these walls that had become her sanctuary. Alexander's response was to rise from his chair and draw her to her feet, pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the cold, and as she rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his heart, she marveled at the strange alchemy that had transformed her father's cruelty into the catalyst for her greatest happiness. They stood thus in the morning light that streamed through the breakfast-room windows until Mrs. Fleming's discreet cough announced her presence with a tea tray and a knowing smile, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm as she stepped back from Alexander's arms while he merely looked at his housekeeper with an expression that dared her to comment. The older woman simply set down the tray and informed them that Lord Greville had sent word he would arrive by noon to discuss certain legal matters pertaining to the upcoming nuptials, and Eleanor caught the significant glance that passed between Alexander and Mrs. Fleming, a silent communication that suggested there were still revelations awaiting her in the days to come. Lord Greville arrived precisely at noon as promised, his red hair windswept from the ride and his sharp eyes immediately finding Eleanor where she stood beside Alexander in the entrance hall, and the solicitor's face broke into a warm smile as he bowed over her hand and declared that he could see why his friend had been so thoroughly transformed in recent weeks, a comment that brought colour to Eleanor's cheeks, and a warning look from Alexander that Greville cheerfully ignored as he allowed Mrs. Fleming to take his coat and usher them all toward the drawing-room where tea awaited. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows as the three of them settled into chairs arranged near the fire, and Eleanor noticed the leather satchel Greville carried with the careful attention of a man transporting something precious, documents she assumed related to marriage settlements and the legal formalities that accompanied unions between families of consequence, though she felt a flutter of anxiety at the reminder that she brought nothing to this match save herself. Alexander must have sensed her discomfort, because he moved his chair closer to hers and took her hand in full view of his friend, a public declaration of affection that made Greville's eyebrows rise appreciatively even as he withdrew papers from his satchel and spread them across the low table between them with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to delivering news that would reshape lives. The first document he presented was familiar enough, a standard marriage contract outlining the settlements Alexander would make upon Eleanor and any children of their union, generous terms that made her breath catch as she read figures that would have seemed fantastical mere weeks ago when she had believed herself worth only £500 to a father eager to be rid of her. But it was the second document that made her hands tremble as she lifted it into the light, for this was a detailed accounting of the transaction between Alexander and Sir Thomas Ashford, and the number written there in Greville's careful hand was not £500, but rather 15,000, a sum so staggering that Eleanor could only stare at the paper, while her mind struggled to comprehend what this meant about everything she had believed about her own value. Alexander's grip on her hand tightened as he explained in low tones that he had paid her father's debts in full, every gambling obligation and outstanding loan, not as purchase price for a daughter, but as the cost of securing her freedom from a man who would have sold her to anyone willing to offer enough coin to cover his losses at the card table. The revelation struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow, reordering her understanding of the past 6 weeks and illuminating the depth of Alexander's commitment long before she had ever agreed to become his wife. And when she turned to look at him through eyes blurred with unshed tears, she saw not the cold duke that society whispered about, but a man who had moved heaven and earth to save a woman he barely knew, because she had once shown kindness to a grieving stranger at a funeral 5 years past. The silence that followed Eleanor's realization stretched between the three of them like a held breath, the drawing-room suddenly feeling too small to contain the magnitude of what she had just learned, and when she finally found her voice, it emerged as barely more than a whisper as she asked Alexander why he had never told her the true sum, why he had allowed her to believe for 6 weeks that her worth to anyone in this world amounted to a mere £500 when he had valued her at 30 times that amount before ever speaking a single word to her. Alexander's hand tightened around hers as he explained that he had feared the knowledge would make her feel obligated to him, that he had wanted whatever grew between them to be untainted by the weight of such a debt, that he could not bear the thought of her gratitude being mistaken for affection or her acceptance of his proposal being colored by a sense that she owed him something for her rescue from her father's cruelty. Lord Greville cleared his throat and excused himself, with the practiced discretion of a man who recognized when his presence had become superfluous, gathering his papers and slipping from the room with a murmured promise to return tomorrow to complete the remaining formalities. And Eleanor barely registered his departure as she struggled to reconcile the image of herself that her father had constructed with the reality that Alexander's actions revealed, the understanding dawning slowly that she had been precious to someone even when she had believed herself worthless. She thought of all the small kindnesses Alexander had shown her since her arrival, the books left where she would find them, the meals prepared to her preferences, the space he had given her to grieve and heal and discover herself within these walls, and she understood now that each gesture had been a declaration he had not felt entitled to speak aloud, a love letter written in acts rather than words by a man who had waited 5 years for the chance to tell her she mattered. The tears she had been fighting finally spilled over as she turned to face him fully, her free hand rising to rest against his cheek, as she told him that she understood now why he had been so patient with her fears, and so careful never to press for more than she was ready to give, that knowing the truth of what he had sacrificed to bring her here only deepened the love she had already confessed, because it showed her the man he truly was beneath the cold exterior. The world believed they knew. Alexander closed his eyes at her touch, his composure fracturing visibly as he admitted that he had been terrified she would see the payment as a purchase rather than a rescue, that she would look at him and see only another man who had treated her as a commodity rather than a person deserving of choice and dignity and love. And when Eleanor silenced his fears with a kiss that tasted of salt tears and hope, she felt something shift between them, the last barrier crumbling as they stood together in the afternoon light and allowed themselves finally to believe that happiness was not merely possible, but already present, already theirs, already home. The days that followed their tearful reconciliation in the drawing room took on a quality that Eleanor could only describe as golden, each hour seeming to glow with a warmth that had nothing to do with the April sunshine streaming through the windows of Pembroke Estate, and everything to do with the man who now moved through her days as though he had always belonged there, his presence no longer a source of uncertainty, but rather an anchor that steadied her against the lingering storms of her past. Alexander had suggested they spend the morning reviewing the marriage settlements together, not because he required her approval, but because he wished her to understand fully what would become hers upon their union, and Eleanor found herself seated beside him at his study desk while he explained each provision with the patience of a man who genuinely valued her comprehension over her mere compliance. The study itself had become familiar to her over the weeks since her arrival, its walls lined with maps and ledgers that spoke to the responsibilities Alexander carried as Duke. But today she noticed details she had missed before: the small portrait of his mother above the fireplace, the worn leather of the chair that suggested countless hours spent in solitary work, the single dried flower pressed between the pages of a book that he quickly moved aside when he caught her, looking. She did not ask about the flower, sensing that some secrets were best discovered in their own time, but she filed the observation away among the growing collection of small truths she was learning about this man who had waited 5 years for the chance to love her openly. The settlement documents themselves were staggering in their generosity: provisions for her personal income, for any daughters they might have, for her security should she outlive him, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten as she recognized the care that had gone into every clause and condition, the determination to ensure she would never again be at the mercy of someone else's cruelty or indifference. When she asked why he had been so thorough in protecting her future, Alexander's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. He had seen what happened to women without protection, had watched his own mother struggle after his father's death before the entail was sorted, and he would not allow Eleanor to face such uncertainty regardless of what the future might hold for either of them. The morning passed in quiet conversation, punctuated by shared cups of tea that Mrs. Fleming refreshed without being asked, and when Alexander finally set aside the last of the documents and turned to face Eleanor fully, his expression held a vulnerability that she was still learning to recognize beneath his composed exterior. He told her that there was one more matter they needed to discuss before the wedding, something he had been reluctant to raise, but which honesty demanded he address, and Eleanor felt her heart quicken with apprehension even as she nodded for him to continue, trusting now that whatever he revealed would not diminish the love growing steadily between them. The matter Alexander needed to discuss concerned her father, and Eleanor felt her shoulders tense instinctively at the mention of the man who had sold her like livestock. But Alexander was quick to reassure her that Sir Thomas posed no immediate threat, explaining instead that he had received word through Lord Greville's contacts that her father had already squandered the £15,000 on new gambling debts and was now attempting to spread rumours through London society that Eleanor had been compromised and ruined, hoping perhaps to extract additional funds or simply to poison any happiness she might find out of pure spite. The news should have devastated her, should have sent her spiraling back into the shame and worthlessness that had defined her existence under her father's roof. But Eleanor found instead that she felt only a distant sadness for a man so consumed by his own demons that he could not recognize the destruction he wrought upon everyone unfortunate enough to depend upon him. And when she told Alexander as much, she watched something shift in his expression, a pride and wonder that made her feel as though she had passed some test she had not known she was taking. He told her that he had already instructed Greville to handle the matter legally, that her father's slander would be met with the full weight of a duke's influence, and that anyone who repeated such lies would find themselves unwelcome in polite society. But more importantly, he wanted her to know that she need never fear her father's power over her again, because she was no longer Eleanor Ashford, the overlooked daughter, but would soon be Eleanor Pembroke, the Duchess of Ravenswood, and no amount of venom from a disgraced baronet could touch her in her new life. Eleanor considered his words carefully, turning them over in her mind as she might examine a particularly complex passage in one of her beloved books, and she realized that what moved her most was not the promise of protection or the elevation of status, but rather the simple fact that Alexander had chosen to tell her, to treat her as a partner deserving of information rather than a delicate creature requiring shelter from unpleasant truths. She told him so, watching his eyes widen slightly at her observation, and then she added that she had spent her entire life being kept ignorant of matters that affected her directly, first by a father who viewed her as inconvenient furniture, and then by a society that deemed women too fragile for knowledge, and she would not tolerate such treatment from the man she intended to marry, regardless of how well-intentioned his motivations might be. The silence that followed her declaration stretched long enough that Eleanor began to wonder if she had overstepped, if her demands for honesty and equality had finally revealed the limits of Alexander's progressive attitudes. But then his face transformed with a smile so genuine and unguarded that she felt her breath catch in her throat, and he told her that she had just given him the greatest gift imaginable, the certainty that he was marrying a woman who would never allow him to become the kind of man who diminished those he loved through false protection.